Okay, calm down.
We are so honored to be bringing back to the show an extremely popular guest, incredibly informed, astute, insightful analyst, Mouin Rabbani, who is a Dutch Palestinian analyst, co-editor of Jadaliyya, and non-resident fellow at the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. He was previously senior analyst at Middle East and special advisor on Israel-Palestine with the International Crisis Group and head of political affairs with the Office of United Nations Special Envoy for Syria. He's a contributor to the book Deluge, Gaza and Israel from Crisis to Cataclysm. So welcome, Mouin.
Hi, Katie. Very good to be with you again.
Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you
And
for having me.
you are such a great source of so much information, and you're especially well positioned to talk about the alleged pogroms that took place in Amsterdam, because you yourself are Dutch Palestinian and you're from the Netherlands. And this is not just a story about what happened in Amsterdam. This is a story about media bias, police brutality, anti-Palestinian racism and bigotry. And it's a very important case study. But we're going to get into the media bias and the way that these people were treated. But tell us first, set up for us what happened, please.
Just by way of background, for many years, the Palestinian Football Association and activists operating under the rubric of Red Card for Israel have been petitioning the International Soccer Federation, FIFA, and the European Soccer Federation, UEFA, to ban the Israeli Football Association, the IFA, from its competitions on the same grounds that were used to suspend the membership of the white minority regime in South Africa and the former Rhodesia. And the position of these bodies has consistently been sports and politics don't mix. Well, that pretext fell apart in February of 2022 when, literally within days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, within 100 hours, both bodies suspended the Russian Football Association and every single Russian club. So, by refusing to take their responsibility, they kind of laid the basis for what happened in Holland earlier this month. The second responsibility falls with the Dutch government. The current Dutch prime minister, kind of Holland's answer to J. Edgar Hoover. He's the former spy chief, and he apparently couldn't figure out the risks involved in allowing this game to continue, particularly not just with any Israeli team, but with one that, even by Israeli standards, is known for the racism and genocidal fanaticism of its supporters. Uh, the game was allowed to continue. The several thousand Maccabi supporters came to the Netherlands, as is common when a team has an away game. And once they arrived in Amsterdam, rather than engaging supporters of the home team, Ajax Amsterdam, in kind of hooliganism and clashes, as is not all that uncommon in the world of football, soccer, whatever you want to call it, they started engaging the locals, particularly those of Arab appearance, who tended to be primarily Dutch Moroccans, and also those who had visible signs of solidarity with the Palestinian people, either because they were wearing keffiyehs or they had Palestinian flags flying from their homes. So there were assaults on passersby based on their appearance. There were vandalism of private homes and so on. And one particular target was taxi drivers, because a large proportion of them are Dutch Moroccans. And those taxi drivers, we're still talking before the game, those taxi drivers then banded together and responded with an assault on the football hooligans. And this is kind of what happened before the game and then escalated further after the game. And I think the other factor to bear in mind is that the Amsterdam police force, I think, like most police forces in the Western world, is institutionally racist, and effectively functioned as a protective guard around the Israeli hooligans. And when these clashes broke out, it was immediately presented as a pogrom, as a racist, anti Semitic uh, act whose sole motivation was hatred of Jews and whose sole purpose was to go after Jews. Well, the only targets of this pogrom were these Israeli soccer hooligans who had been engaging not only in violence themselves and assaults, largely under police protection, but they had also been going through the center of Amsterdam yelling racist and genocidal chants, their favorite slogan, pretty much Israel's national anthem, death to the Arabs, may your village burn. There are no schools left in Gaza because all the children are dead, and so on and so forth. And this was then immediately presented by the media as first of all, as a pogrom. Second of all, as one that was conducted by the Muslims, primarily Dutch of Moroccan background. And it just went on from there, and not a single Dutch leading politician came out in defense of their own citizens. The mayor of Amsterdam, instead of coming out in defense of her residents, basically, as she later admitted, parroted the line on this incident put forward by none other than the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu that same night, that this was a pogrom against Jews. Well, a pogrom against Jews would be directed not only at violent Israeli soccer hooligans chanting genocidal chants through the center of Amsterdam. One would anticipate that it would also be directed at, for example, Dutch Jews, at Dutch Jewish institutions, at Dutch Jewish properties. But there was none of that, even though on the same night, the Jewish community of Amsterdam was holding its commemoration of Kristallnacht, uh, which, the notorious ransacking and murder of Jews and Jewish property in Germany, Nazi Germany, in 1938. That same night, the commemoration of that event was held in the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam. Now, the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam is a very well-known landmark. Yet there were no disturbances there. There was no attempt to attack or ransack it. So this was very much a clash between the Israeli soccer hooligans and those they had attacked and vandalized. Were there anti-Semitic slurs expressed during that night? Yes, there were. There were a few instances. Nothing compared to the almost uniformly anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian genocidal chants uh, being shouted and screamed by the Israeli hooligans. But there was, to be clear, um, instances of anti-Semitism by those who were attacking the hooligans. But that was then used to generalize about the whole event, that it was somehow should be seen in the context of the European history of anti-Semitism, of Kristallnacht, of the Holocaust, rather than being seen in its proper context, Israel, what Israel is doing in the Gaza Strip, and most specifically, the conduct of these violent, racist, genocidal Israeli football hooligans.
That's, of course, one of the many examples of how Israel is, Israel is contributing to anti-Semitism, because they live streamed this genocide and claimed to act in the name of Jews. And then you have people like on this, the Maccabi fans, and there's the image of the Jewish star. So while I'm not, condoning statements of anti-Semitism, it certainly, I would say, is much more understandable than people chanting overtly racist things about Palestinians. And as you pointed out, the condemnation of anti-Semitism as a generalization based on a few comments, we don't see the equivalent condemnation of what the Maccabi people were doing based on their much more prevalent racist
Yes,
comments.
yes, and I'm not talking about, the Dutch leadership and leading Dutch politicians refusing to say anything in support of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, whose mass murder and extermination was being openly advocated by these Israeli hooligans. I'm talking about Dutch citizens, residents of Amsterdam, who were being violently assaulted and whose properties were being vandalized by these people. And neither the mayor of Amsterdam, nor the Dutch prime minister, nor the leader of the Dutch opposition, nor any prominent member of any of the coalition partners, nor any Dutch government minister uttered a single word in defense of the victims of these hooligans. Rather, they demonized and delegitimized and you began to see calls, for withdrawing their citizenship and expelling them from the country, and so on. And this, I think, the missing part of the story in much of the coverage is that this was not only about, what actually happened, that we saw on our televisions, or rather what was distorted by the media, but there's another important element of this, and this has to do with Dutch politics.
Double Down News, which is a great, great, great YouTube channel and kind of production house, put together a really informative video. They often do these. And here we're going to see a journalist named Richard Sanders who breaks down some of the media bias that was on display around the Amsterdam incident. So let's take a look at that.
Disinformation. Now, let's make our focus here a very specific bit of footage. If you watch certainly the initial reports from the BBC, The Guardian, CNN, and other outlets, they all rely very heavily on a specific bit of footage of individuals in the street being attacked by a mob of hooded men.
Crowds of people assaulted Israeli fans after Thursday night's match.
Israel said that Israeli supporters were attacked in a very violent incident as they left the ground.
Vicious attacks upon people purely because they're Israelis and Jews.
This was continuously used to illustrate the violence that Maccabi Tel Aviv supporters had suffered. The Times of India used Annette's footage and even went so far as to refer to it as Israeli nationals abducted in Hamas-style attack. Now, that footage was shot by a local citizen journalist called Annette de Graaf, who I've spoken to quite a bit over the last few days. Her footage does not show Israeli fans being attacked at all. In fact, it shows the precise opposite. The mobs of hooded figures we see in that footage are Maccabi Tel Aviv fans. If you look very carefully at Annette's footage, you can see that a number of individuals are wearing blue and yellow, which are the Maccabi colours. The people they are attacking are individual Dutch citizens. Annette goes online, actually says, no, hang on. The footage doesn't show that. It shows the exact opposite. She is ignored. She starts having to interact with various news agencies, pleading with them to change the way they are using her own footage. Firstly, Reuters, terribly important because Reuters provides footage to other news organizations around the world. With the footage, what Reuters distributes is a thing called a dope sheet. This is a basic explanation to their clients of what they're looking at, what this footage is. Now, Annette spoke to Reuters at enormous length very early in the morning on the Friday, the day after the violence, and explained to them, gave them chapter and verse, told them exactly what this was. The following evening, they rang back. They clearly weren't terribly satisfied with this and quizzed her again. And she was absolutely emphatic. The people committing the violence here are Maccabi Tel Aviv fans. Now, I've obtained a copy of the Reuters dope sheet for this one. It begins, clashes broke out outside Amsterdam Central Station in the early hours of Friday, November the 8th, in what Israeli authorities said was an attack targeting Israeli citizens. Their opening line, despite what Anna has told them, continues to frame it with the Maccabi fans as being the victims here. It then does address what Annette had told them. An eyewitness at the scene claims these people are fans of Maccabi Tel Aviv. However, Reuters cannot independently verify this claim. Now, that is quite extraordinary. She's not an eyewitness at the scene. She is the originator of the material, and she's not guessing. She had been following this mob of hooligans for a quarter of an hour. She knows damn well who they are. So what they've done here is an absolute classic bit of obfuscation. They've got a bit of footage that they're distributing to the world's media, which shows Israeli football hooligans did not meet their standard.
Sorry, I want to forward a little bit.
Absolutely crystal clear about it. She made it very clear to them. What they were looking at was hooliganism by Israeli football fans. The next morning, something very interesting happens. A woman called Alice Porter, a reporter for Sky News, produces a very unusual report. It absolutely stands out from all the other reporting, not because it's an exceptional bit of journalism, it's a bog standard bit of journalism. It's an accurate description of what had happened in Amsterdam. And within hours, it was taken down, and Sky re-edited it and put it up again with a note saying the previous version did not meet their standards for balance and impartiality. And the most striking bit is they continue to use Annette's footage. In her original piece, Alice Porter had said,
Maccabi fans were seen attacking locals as a police car can be seen driving by.
By the time you get to the re-edited version, that script line has become,
A video posted on social media shows a large group of hooded men dressed in black running down the street and striking people at random.
What has happened there, Sky News, who know perfectly well what this footage shows and had originally accurately reported it, is now pretending that it doesn't know, basically to lie to their viewers.
There have been a lot of new standards of imbalance and partiality set by the media, the corporate media, the Western corporate media during the past year with respect to Gaza, with respect to Palestinians, with respect to Arabs more generally. And although no one was killed in Amsterdam, I think the thorough, deliberate, premeditated, systematic distortion of what really happened in Amsterdam in order to put forward this thoroughly false account, which reflects Israel's propaganda line, and to basically extend the narrative that, you know, what happened in Amsterdam is a pogrom against Jews, just as what's happening in the Middle East is not a genocide of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, but rather also a pogrom and against Jews. I think this Amsterdam story, even taking into account all the lies, fabrications, distortions, and so on that we've seen during the past year, I think this one really set an absolutely new depth, new standard, if you will, of imbalance and partiality, to coin a phrase used by Sky News. And you know, you have also, sorry, just on the same, this video taken by the Dutch citizen journalist Annette de Graaf. The New York Times used it as well. And when they finally felt compelled to issue a correction, and I think Electronic Intifada ran a story about this recently, when they were finally forced to issue a correction, they didn't issue a correction. They simply deleted the video, because if the video doesn't fit into the propaganda narrative, well, if you know, you're certainly not going to give an accurate rendition of events, you just delete the story.
That actually reminds me of Jamie Lee Curtis early on, like I think maybe it was October of 2023. She, in all her infinite stupidity, put on Instagram an image that was from the New York Times, and it showed a few young children. One of them was carrying another child, and they were looking up at the sky. And she wrote something like "terror from the skies" and is an Israeli flag or something. And people pointed out, actually, those are Palestinian kids. And instead of pretending to care about Palestinians and correcting it and saying, you know, both sides are suffering or end the war or doing some like both sidesing thing, no, she just deleted the post.
Yes, because even an anodyne statement of concern for all human life is unacceptable in this situation. 99% partiality is treason. It's either 110% or you're an enemy.
What were you going to say, by the way, about Dutch politics?
The context here is that the Netherlands recently had an election in which the far right emerged as the largest party. Didn't win a majority. No party ever wins a majority in Dutch parliamentary elections. But traditionally, the leader of the largest party is appointed as a prime minister. And in the case of the most recent elections, the leader of the largest party is Geert Wilders, who basically makes Trump look like a social democrat. And he managed to find three other parties who were willing to form a coalition with him, but only on condition that he not assume the prime ministership, because they felt he would be too big of an embarrassment to the country on the European and international stage. He agreed, and then he appointed Dick Schoof, the former spy chief, as a prime minister. And so, and then also the mayor of Amsterdam, Femke Halsema, is the former leader of the Green Left Party, and she kind of represents everything Wilders and the other parties on the right and the far right hate. I mean, she's been subjected to more sexism and misogynistic abuse from Wilders and his people than we've seen in the entire history of Islam in recent years. So the context here is that in addition to what actually happened in Amsterdam, you have this polarization, this conflict, this struggle for power and dominance between left and right, between the right and the far right, and most intensively within the far right. So what happened is that all these people, all these leaders began grandstanding, trying to outdo each other in demonizing their own citizens, particularly, as very similar, I should add, to the way people in Europe spoke about Jews in the late 19th and early 20th century. It's uncanny, the resemblance. And these people don't speaking about Muslims, and particularly Dutch of Moroccan background, because to these ignoramuses, Arabs and Muslims are always conflated. These people don't belong here. They don't share our norms and values. We have to get rid of them. And there's now actual proposals to make anti-Semitism a terrorist offense, on the basis of which people convicted can have their citizenship revoked if they have a second citizenship, which many do, and deported. So we're really beginning to see this kind of exclusionary race baiting, and it wasn't just Wilders. I mean, the prime minister himself was engaged in this, and again trying to point out that the real aggressors here were the Dutch of Moroccan background, even though they were hardly the only ones who fought back against the hooligans. And of course, the innocent angelic victims in this story, just as in the Gaza Strip, are of course the Israelis. So I think political context is just important, because it explains a lot of the grandstanding, a lot of the extremist rhetoric about pogroms and anti-Semitism and so on. And it's still continuing, and in fact escalating. Interestingly, the mayor of Amsterdam, who is as guilty of this as anyone else, has now backtracked and said she shouldn't have used the term pogrom, and that she should have come out in defense of those who live in the city that she leads. And most remarkably, in making that statement, she said the reason she called it a pogrom was because Netanyahu had. So basically, shamelessly, without batting an eyelid in public, she admitted that she was simply parroting what the Israeli prime minister said. And, Wilders, this far right leader, he's already been convicted by a Dutch court of discrimination. And in 2014, at a public rally, he said, do you want more or less Moroccans? And the crowd started chanting less, less, less. He said, well, we're going to arrange that. I mean, these things are not entirely foreign to Dutch or European history if one goes back a century. And the thing about all these people is, if you look at the way they talk about Palestinians, the way they talk about Arabs, the way they talk about Muslims, if they made half these statements, if they made even a quarter of these statements about Jews, they would all be, rightfully, I should add, in prison by the existing law. But when you're talking about the weakest and most vulnerable members of society, as is so often the case, anything goes, and the more the merrier.
And what's even scarier is that if they said comments like this about Israelis or Zionists, not about Jews,
God
but if they
forbid.
made
Yeah.
comments like that, they would be treated like anti-Semites. And we're going to get into why that's so dangerous